Buckle up, guys, you are in for a rude awakening. So I will read you parts of the blog in automatic translation. It was a Russian blog originally posted in Russian internet by Orey Volod, and I spent my today I spent some time trying to check whether the information was correct, but yeah, it was confirmed by the original sources that he was referring to, including the post by so-called researchers and scientists in the Western world, published in their official research universities. So I'll read it as it is, okay? So as a press story, I would say that I was watching videos by somebody named Andrei Tuняев, and he is like a engineer, and he was into this what is called rocket science, and he's a scientist and author of many books, and they are about conspiracies mostly, but we know that conspiracies are not theories by now. And he was talking about what nobody talks about mostly. So when you watch all these YouTube videos by these so-called opinion leaders who are called, quote, alternatives, don't look much into them, but look into what they don't make videos about. So this Andrei Tuняев man, what he was talking about in his videos for a while now, it's about missing people. So once he made a video about missing people and the police, missing people in Russia, and the police came to his home. And he said, but I use the official statistics of missing people per year. This is about 6,000. Shouldn't you be concerned? And they told him, no, not really. And this is because 6,000 people a year is not such a big number as comparing to what he said the US, for example, where it is 200,000, and this is like a small city number per year. Anyways, back to his videos. Couple of months ago he made a video, and in his video he doesn't talk about sensitive subjects that much, but he makes due headlines. So one of the headlines was really alarming to me, as he was predicting in the headlines very tough, rude reality that would be expected from the Europeans, and as considered that history is circular and the past tends to repeat. So anyways, I will read you up this Russian blog. I didn't change anything to it because I just used automatic translation. Some phrases will sound funny. So by Orey Volod, original in Russian, at maxpark.com. If you now ask Prince Charles to recommend you some tincture to improve digestion, then he will surely offer you something herbal with dandelion. And artichoke roots. But just 300 years ago, royal people at the slightest ailment absorbed drugs based on the bones, blood, skin, entrails and teeth of the dead. Prescription books of doctors in the 17th century were full of heartbreaking recipes using these components. For example, With sore joints or getting rid of wrinkles, there was nothing better than rubbing with human fat. That was the time of the development of the medicinal cannibalism, the most appropriate term for this, and drugs using parts of the bodies of the dead were used as often as we now take paracetamol. Well, we don't know what paracetamol is made of. In 1562, Queen Elizabeth, 1558-1603, contracted the then very common smallpox disease. The girl managed to survive, but for the rest of her life, ugly pockmarks remained on her face. In the future, to mask them, the queen used white lead, and according to some sources, human fat mixed with beeswax and turpentine oil. Fat was taken from fresh corpses, mainly from those who were executed by hanging. Queen Elizabeth's personal surgeon John Ballister actively advocated the treatment of ulcers, wounds and bleeding by Egyptian mummies, which after the looting of the graves fell into the British Museum. They were in such good condition that many believed that they contained great healing powers. For medicinal purposes, parts of the mummies were crushed into powder and mixed with drink. This also applies to bandages. Queen Elizabeth also suffered greatly from bad teeth, which, given the level of development of dentistry, was not surprising. She eventually lost almost all her teeth. According to the medicine of those years, for the treatment of teeth, she probably used powder from the teeth of the dead mixed with the milk of a dog. For the treatment of caries and holes in the teeth, by the way, the partridge brain was actively used, although what exactly was passed off as a teeth still a big question. After Elizabeth, King James I, 1603-1625, came to the English throne, who later became known as the most disgusting monarch in history since he never washed. From a young age, he began to suffer from severe gout, and his personal physician, Theodore Turquet de Mayerne, rubbed a drug made from human fat into his joints. James also given a prescription for arthritis consisting of scrapings from a fresh human skull from an unburied one, along with herbs and white wine to be drunk on full moon. Skulls in general were actively used in medicine by both the rich and the poor from the 16th to the beginning of the 19th century. Sometimes their bones were used, sometimes, quote, moss from the skull, unquote. True, even James had limit of disgust, and he evaded the absorption of individual parts of the body of corpses and once refused the powder from the skull. After James, the infamous King Charles I, who was beheaded in 1649, ruled. There were rumors among the people that the blood of the crowned lady was very beneficial for health, and when Charles' blood splashed under the executioner's axe, hundreds of the afflicted rushed to him to collect it. The next King Charles II, known as a Joker, spent as much as £6,000 in 1670 on a mixture of skull powder and liquid called Goddard's drops. After the chemist who invented it, the recipe could be used to treat so many diseases. Being a complete alcoholic, Charles II often needed reliable hangover cures, and he was invented a special recipe based on the same drops of Goddard's. In the 17th century, a memoirist wrote that dismembered corpse of a stillborn infant, possibly his own son, was found in a chemist's office, which he used for his experiments. Another monarch who liked to take drops from the skull was William III, 1689-1702. He constantly took them during epileptic seizures, which for his crown drank were even worse than a stutter. There were many prescriptions for the treatment of epilepsy. For example, one was based on the powder from the ashes of the babies. And then there were recipes from bear genitals, puppies, fly larvae, mating earthworms. It is quite difficult to imagine what exactly the healers' opinions were based on, including this or that component in the recipe. Fortunately, by the beginning of the 19th century, most of the strange cannibal recipes had gone into oblivion, although some still walk among the people of Great Britain. Dr. Sugg, S-U-G-G. A new book on the healing properties of cannibalism says that in the late 18th century, the royal family of Britain ate parts of human bodies. The author of the book adds that this practice was not only the privilege of monarchs, but was widespread in the highest circles of Europe. Medical cannibalism. While in their deathbeds, Queen Mary II in 1698 and her uncle King Charles II in 1685 both ate the insides of a human skull, according to Dr. Sugg. Even while denouncing New World cannibalism, the monarchs used, drank, or carried the ashes of Egyptian mummies, human fat, flesh, bones, blood, brains, and skin. According to Dr. Sugg of Durham University, tumors removed from the brains of dead soldiers were used as a cure for nosebleeds. Dr. Sugg says parts of the human body, such as meat, blood, or bones, have been widely used as therapeutic agents in the most common method of treatments. Cases of cannibalism occurred not only in New World, as is commonly believed, but also in Europe. Things that are still rarely taught in schools are recorded in the artistic and literary text of the past. These are facts such as, for example, that James first banned the use of corpses for medical purposes. Charles II developed his own medicines extracted from corpses, and Charles I was also involved in using corpses to create medicines. Along with Charles II, the list of prominent users of figures in the field of cadaveric medicine included Francis I, Elizabeth I, surgeon John Bannister, Countess of Kent Elizabeth Grey, Robert Boyle, Thomas Willis, William III, and Queen Mary. Dr. Sachs argues that history of medical cannibalism raises a number of important social questions. According to Sachs, medical cannibalism has benefited from the impressive experience of European science, publishing, trade networks, and educational science. Although cadaveric medicine has sometimes been portrayed as a medieval therapy, it flourished during the social and scientific revolutions that took place in early modern Britain. These traditions survived until the 18th century, and among the poor it lingered until the era of Queen Victoria. Cannibalism aside, the use of human body parts now seems highly unethical to us. During the heyday of medicinal cannibalism, it was common to remove organs or bones from the burials in Egyptian tombs or European cemeteries. Moreover, it somehow happened that in the 18th century, the largest import from Ireland to Great Britain was the import of human skulls. It is difficult to say whether all this was much worse than the modern black market for human organs. The book contains numerous vivid, sometimes disturbing examples of practice ranging from the gallows of Germany and Scandinavia through the courts and laboratories of Italy, France, and Britain to the battlefields of Holland and Ireland and the cannibal tribes of North and South America. A 1649 painting depicting the execution of Charles I shows people collecting the king's blood with handkerchiefs. Dr. Sachs says the process was commonly referred to as the king's evil. The ailment was almost often cured by the touch of a living monarch. In continental Europe, where the axe often took off the heads of criminals, blood was common remedy for epileptics. In Denmark, young Hans Christian Andersen witnessed how parents gave their sick child to drink with blood flowing from the scaffold. Such treatments was so popular that executioners often had to hire assistants to collect blood from the throats of murdered criminals in cups. Sometimes patients thought to shorten the path of treatment. During the execution in Germany in the early 16th century, a tramp grabbed the headless body before it fell and drank the blood from it. Unquote. The last recorded case of this practice in Germany dates back to 1865. While James I refused to eat the inside of human skull, his grandson, Charles II, liked the idea so much that he bought the recipe. Having paid about £6,000 for it, he often removed the insides from the skull himself in his personal laboratory. According to Dr. Sugg, soon to be known as King's Drops, this medicine was used to treat epilepsy, convulsions, headaches, and often as an emergency for the dying. The inside of the skull was the first thing Charles demanded on the 2nd of February when he was dying. A few centuries ago, when universities were already open and the greatest humanists lived, cannibalism in Europe was commonplace. From the dead, they made cadavers mummieux, all kinds of extracts that were used as a medicine. Essential oils. Human flesh was considered one of the best medicines. Everything went into business, from the top of the head to the toes. For example, the English King Charles II regularly drank the tincture of human skulls. For some reason, skulls from Ireland were considered especially healing, and they were brought to the kings from there. So there is a quote somewhere. The best is to get a body of a red-haired man, 24 years of age, which was died by manslaughter. That was written by German doctor Johann Schröder in 17th century. The redheads have a lighter blood and their flesh is more healthy. So this is an article by Ivan Kemerov titled "In Europe, Cannibalism was way more developed than once in South America or New Guinea." Yeah, they tend to say that all these indigenous people on those islands were such a primitive Neanderthals, unlike them. So anyways, the places of public executions were always crowded with epileptics. It was believed that the blood splashed during decapitation cured them of this disease. In general, many diseases were treated with blood at that time, so Pope Innocent VIII regularly drank the blood extracted from 3 boys, it was said. It was allowed to take fat from the dead until the end of the 18th century. It was rubbed in for various skin diseases. Most of the current ethical norms of European civilization are only about 200 years old. Things that are extremely taboo today, such as cannibalism, were commonplace back in the 18th century. Priests drank children's blood, epilepsy was treated with the fat of the executed, and the production of mummies, which were eaten as medicine, was put on a conveyor. This part of European history should be remembered by obscurantists and liberals alike. The former claim that their actions, whether laws on blasphemy or religious education, are a return to tradition, spirituality, and holiness. Secondly, liberals must be aware of how easy it is to fall into degradation by advocating pedophilia or the use of hard drugs. Everything that both these camps call for an archive, Europe has already gone through, and even several times in a circle in the 2,500 years of its existence. Female priesthood, pedophilia, slavery, anarchist and communist communities, etc. You just need to look into the past, extrapolate that experience on the present, in order to understand how things will work now. Also, the European experience shows that there are no unshakable ethical norms. What was considered pathological yesterday is becoming the norm today, and vice versa, and so several times in a circle. Take one of the most important taboos of our civilization, cannibalism. It is unequivocally condemned by all sections of society, religious, political, legislative, public, and so on. In the 20th century, force majeure situations such as famine, as was the case during the famine in the Volga region and during the siege of Leningrad, are not enough to justify cannibalism. This cannot serve as an excuse for society. The most monstrous robbery of Egyptian tombs began with the mummy fishery. However, the game was worse. Yet, according to the report of the healer Abd al-Latif, dated around 1200, a mummy obtained from 3 human skulls was sold for 50 dirhams. A dirham is a silver coin weighing 1.5 grams. Demand caused an enormous revival of trade in this very curative potion. The enterprise merchants of Cairo and Alexandria ensured that mumia became an important export to Europe. They hired whole crowds of Egyptian peasants to excavate necropolises. Merchant corporations exported ground human bones to all corners of the world. In the 14th, 15th centuries, Shilajit has become a common remedy sold in pharmacies and herbal shops. When raw materials became scarce again, they began to use the corpses of executed criminals, the bodies of those who died in almshouses or dead Christians, drying them in the sun. This is how, quote, real mummies were made. But since this method of supplying the market did not cover demand, the methods of making mumia took other forms. The robbers stole freshly buried bodies from the grave, dismembered them, and boiled them in cauldrons until the muscles separated from the bones. The oily liquid dripped from the cauldron and poured into flasks was sold for big money to Italian merchants. For example, in 1564, the French doctor Guy de La Fontaine from Navarre discovered piles of bodies of several hundred slaves in the warehouse of one of the merchants in Alexandria, which were intended for processing into mumia. Soon Europeans also joined the trade in processing corpses. In particular, John Sanderson, an Alexandrian agent of the Turkish Trading Company, in 1585 received an order from the board to join the mumia trade. Approximately 600 pounds of mummified and dried carrion he sent by sea to England. However, it has become more cost-effective to get this shilajit right on the spot in Europe. Already in the 14th century, the corpses of recently deceased people and executed criminals began to be used to make mumia. It happened that the executioners sold fresh blood and, quote, human fat directly from the scaffold. How this was done is described in the book by O. Kroll, published in 1609 in Germany. Quote, take an undamaged clean corpse of a red-haired man 24 years old executed not earlier than 1 day ago, preferably by hanging, wheeling, or impalement. Keep it 1 day and 1 night under the sun and moon, and then cut into large pieces of sprinkle with myrrh powder and aloe so that it's not too bitter. The flesh must be kept for several days in wine, alcohol, then hung in the shade and dried in the breeze. After that, you will again need wine alcohol to restore the red tint to the flesh. Since the appearance of the corpse inevitably causes nausea, it would be good to soak this mummy in olive oil for a month. The oil absorbs the trace elements of the mummy, and it can also be used as a medicine, especially an antidote for snake bites. Another recipe was offered by the famous pharmacist Nicolas Lefebvre in his complete book of chemistry, published in London in 1664. First of all, he wrote, you need to cut off the muscles from the body of a healthy young man, soak them in wine, alcohol, and then hang them in a cool, dry place. If the air is very humid and raining, then these muscles should be hung in a pipe and dried every day on a gentle fire, from juniper with needles and cones to the state of corned beef, which sailors take on long voyages. Daring sailors. Gradually, the technology of making medicines from human bodies became even more sophisticated. The healers proclaimed that this healing power would increase if the corpse of the sacrificial person was used. For example, in the Arabian Peninsula, men between the ages of 70 and 80 gave their bodies to save others. They ate nothing, only drank honey and took baths from it. A month later, they themselves began to exude this honey in the form of urine and feces. After the sweet old people died, their bodies were placed in a stone sarcophags filled with the same honey. After 100 years, the remains were taken out, so they got a medicinal substance, confection, which, as they believed, should instantly cure a person of all diseases. And in Persia, in order to prepare such preparation, a young man under 30 was needed. As a compensation for his death, he was well fed for some time and gratified in every possible way. He lived like a prince, and then he was drowned in a mixture of honey, hashish, and medicinal herbs. The body was sealed in a coffin and opened only after 150 years. Such a passion for eating mummies first led to the fact that in Egypt, by about 1600, 95% of the tombs were looted, and in Europe by the end of the 17th century, cemeteries had to be guarded by armed guards. Only in the middle of the 18th century in Europe, one state after another began to pass laws either significantly restricting the eating of the flesh of corpses or completely prohibiting it. Finally, mass cannibalism on the continent stopped only by the end of the first third of the 19th century. Although in some distant corners of Europe it was practiced until the end of this century, in Ireland and Sicily it was not forbidden to eat a dead child before his baptism. Continue. And even in the 20th century, echoes of that practice remained. The manufacture of medicine using human flesh. For example, quote, the dissertation of A.M. Hudaz, made in 1951 at the Azerbaijan Medical Institute, is devoted to the external use for burns of a drug obtained from human corpses, cadaverol. Cada means corpse. The drug was prepared from internal fat, melting it in a water bath. Using it for burns made it possible, according to the author, to reduce the duration of treatment by almost half. For the first time, human fat called humanol was used for therapeutic purposes in surgical practice by the Dr. Godlander in 1909. In the USSR, it was also used by L.D. Kortavov in 1938. And here is another one. The substance obtained after prolonged boiling of dead bodies may well be curative. Of course, this is still only a hypothesis, but at one of the scientific and practical seminars, specialists from the research laboratory of Makara showed the mummy artificially obtained by them. Scientists call this substance MOS, a mineral organic substrate. Such a clever words. Research protocols testified MOS is able to increase the working capacity of people, reduce the period of rehabilitation after radiation damage, and increase male potency. The German practice of processing concentration camp prisoners for soap, leather, fertilizer, etc. during the Second World War, therefore, was not some kind of innovation for Europe 150-200 years before the Nazis. All this was still the norm. This practice, including number, confirms that German Nazism was a sharp rollback back into archaic. But even today, in the 21st century, Western civilization still legally consumes human flesh. This is the placenta. Moreover, the fashion for eating the placenta is growing from year to year. In many Western maternity hospitals, there is even an order for its use. Either give birth to women in labor or hand it over to laboratories that produce hormonal preparations based on it. You can read more about this here. It is possible to recognize the fashion for eating the human placenta as one of the signs of the rollback of Western civilization into archaic. Probably yes. Medicinal cannibalism in early modern English literature and culture is one of those rare books that transforms one's understanding of cultural history. It's from Amazon. So, medicinal cannibalism in early modern English literature. This is the title, and culture. Is one of those rare books that transforms one's understanding of cultural history. Its originality lies in the way it is systematically opens up the bizarre contradiction in early modern attitudes to cannibalism, which enables the extreme horror of anthrophagus violence that informs the fantasies of New World discovery to coexist with Europeans' routine consumption of human tissue in the form of pharmaceutical mummy. In the process, Noble's analysis generates superb close readings of major literary texts, rendering them, as the best criticism always does, fascinatingly unfamiliar. Michael Neal, Emeritus Professor of English, University of Auckland. So the book is Medicinal Cannibalism in Early Modern English Literature and Culture, Early Modern Culture Studies, 1500, 1700, 2011 edition by L. Noble, author. Quote, great sensitivity, learning, and empathy for the medical practices of the past are on rich display in the medical cannibalism in early modern English. Literature and culture. Noble uncovers the almost taboo subject of the early modern mummy, the medical corpse which provided healing fluids revered by medical practitioners all over modern Europe for its potency. Students of Shakespeare will remember Othello's handkerchief dyed in mummy conserved of maidens' hearts, quote unquote. But Noble follows the trail of mumia much further, unpacking the literary tradition elsewhere in Shakespeare. In the Fairy Queen and Dawn's devotions upon emergent occasions, in order to show its metaphorical suggestiveness for the body's transmutation over time. Noble wants to show the natural desire for health and wholeness that underlines the bizarre early modern uses of the medicinal corpse, but he almost makes a she almost makes a compelling case for connections between early modern uses of corpse matter and the contemporary traffic in body parts for organ donations and transplantations. Hers is a narrative of wonder and weirdness made understandable, a fascinating case study of the body's inexhaustible semiotic potential in the hands of indigenous literary and medicinal practitioners. Gail Kern Pasteur, Director, Folger Shakespeare Library. This is an important book. Noble study of early modern literary and dramatic treatments of corpse pharmacology, as she calls it, not only persuades the reader that the medicinal consumption of dead human flesh was central to the early modern cultural imaginary, it also makes a compelling case for why the early modern trade in mummy is of pressing importance to us now. Jonathan Gill Harris, Professor of English, George Washington University. About the author. Louise Noble, lecturer in the English department of the School of Arts at the University of New England, Armidale, New South Wales, Australia. So, yeah. And this goes along with that David Icke, Arizona Wilder, Mother Goddess interview. It is David Icke, Mother Goddess interview. It's shadow banned on YouTube, but you can still find it, I suppose. And so yeah, it's called Arizona Wilder, Mother Goddess, 1998 David Icke interview. She talks about this. And of course we remember all these Planned Parenthood stories. And modern cosmetics and them trying to popularize vampire stuff like this Eclipse movies, Teenage Heartthrob. And you don't forget that this friend of Aaron Dover said that they took out Aaron Dover's brain when he committed suicide, allegedly.